Hola, buenas tardes. Ya lamentablemente tenemos que concluir este congreso y lo hacemos con una figura importante dentro del mundo de las distopías. Es el profesor Gregory Claeys, viene de la Universidad de Londres, es un experto en pensamiento político. Él ha dado clases en St. Louis, en la Universidad Royal Holloway de Londres. También ha dado e imparte regularmente conferencias por todo el mundo. Ya ha creado su propia editorial, es editor de la Palgrave Studies in Utopianism, y su obra más reciente es esta, Dystopia, a Natural History, publicada por Oxford University Press. Esta edición quizás sea un poco cara, porque ya sabéis todos que lo del hardback es caro, pero en mayo creo que va a aparecer la edición en el libro de bolsillo para que todos podamos disfrutarla, ¿no? Bien, hoy el profesor Claeys nos va a hablar de The Progress of Dystopia Today. Él va a hablar en inglés, pero podéis seguir fácilmente la conferencia en español, porque se os han entregado unas fotocopias. Si alguien no tiene la fotocopia, creo que están... Pablo las tiene. Y ahí también, en la esquina de la mesa, también hay fotocopias para poderla seguir en inglés o en español, como prefiráis.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming here. Thank you for this warm introduction and for the invitation to come to talk to you today. I realize I've come at the end of your meeting here, but since dystopia is about endings anyway, I don't feel so embarrassed by this, although I realize I've missed what I hear have been some very interesting discussions over the last couple of days. So I'm going to read this text in English. You have the text in Spanish before you, which I'm I'm sure has been extremely competently translated. So I will plunge straight in, and I hope we have some time for discussion afterwards. I want to commence with a brief anecdote. Amongst the many dozens of events held in 2016, 2 years ago, to commemorate the 500th anniversary of More's Utopia, one at Somerset House in London was introduced by a man named Jeremy Reiki, with the comment that More's book did not present a single vision of a utopia, but was instead an invitation to dream, to think, to imagine a better world. We are constantly, Reiki said, bombarded with news of all the terrible things that are happening in the world. So to actually have a moment to say, let's not think about the future as a dystopia, it's very rare and very exciting. As I want today to discuss the utility of dystopia as a means of discerning and understanding our real possible futures, it's worthwhile pausing at the outset to probe just exactly what Mr. Reiki's sentiment reveals. This viewpoint represents an ideal of utopia as escapism. It is analogous to sitting on a commuter train on the way to work, I'm sure we've all had this experience, and wishing one was winging off to some tropical holiday. It is purely gratuitous, wishful thinking. It juxtaposes the well-known view, which insists that utopia must be about hope, to the acknowledgement that what people really fear is a future which is undeniably bleak and oppressively frightening. So this is, for all intents and purposes, simply an exercise in denial. It substitutes fantasy for reality, rather than augmenting reality by the imaginative reconstruction of possible futures. I want to argue here, by contrast to this view, that the juxtaposition of reality to fantasy serves, sometimes anyway, humanity poorly. The function of dystopia across some 2 centuries has been to offer long-term projections concerning our future in which the possibility of negative outcomes looms large. The chief advantage of dystopia here is the same as that of utopia, the long-term perspective which lifts us above the immediacy of politics and the oppressive complexity of our everyday concerns. Dystopia, however, possesses an empirical dimension sometimes, though not always, lacking in utopian speculation. It warns of the possible failure of plans, of a shortfall of energy, of the weakness or failings of human nature, and sometimes of the inadequacy of utopian thinking itself. But some utopias, of course, are not anti-utopias in the usual sense of the word. So let's see how this works historically with a few examples drawn from the book which has just been so kindly recommended to you. I offer a few disclaimers at the outset. I've not here in this talk this afternoon entered into the much vexed issue of how we distinguish utopia from dystopia. I do that in the book, obviously. Whether from more onwards, all utopias contain some dystopian elements. This is a very vexing, troublesome problem. Or what schemes of progression from one kind of society to the other, positive to negative, past to present to future and back, we need to consider to make theoretical sense of these traditions. These are complex issues. Many early modern utopias rely upon slavery, Moors indeed, and in some later ones, the utopia of one group seems to imply a dystopia for others, in Orwell's 1984, for instance, as well as in Huxley's Brave New World. I'm instead, rather simplistically, relying here this afternoon on a definition of utopia as the good place, spelled E-U-topia, which most people regard as considerably better than the present world. I leave aside here also questions of marginally better or temporarily better places, like festivals, where utopias might be realized for a short period, which we might label heterotopic utopias. Some of you will know Foucault's term here. Dystopia is, by contrast, a state generally viewed as much worse, even though this needs to be regarded as an extremely problematic schema for framing a very diverse set of texts. To be able to unite consideration of real and fictional societies, we can conceive of utopias as societies dominated by an ideal akin to friendship, or what I call enhanced sociability, and dystopias as societies dominated by fear. So we have a kind of spectrum here. The ideal society, the utopia, EU-topia, where people are in close proximity and closely bonded with one another as friends of a kind. At the opposite extreme, people are afraid of each other, they're alienated from one another, they're isolated and alienated then. This gives us what I call a realist or essentialist definition, which enables us to juxtapose literary texts to actual societies, and thus to concede that EU-topia can and actually has been achieved. This flies in the face, of course, of common language usage, as we think of utopia as nowhere, but EU-topia can be achieved and has been achieved. So that's the first of the main claims I'm making. Though my concern today is broadly with fiction, utopianism, the recognition of the three faces of the utopian tradition, demands that we treat literary texts which portray ideal past, conditions, or futures, and the utopian or dystopian conditions themselves conceived empirically. So the middle third of this book is about the real dystopias, mostly in the 20th century. So, briefly then, the history of dystopia. Prior to the French Revolution, a variety of satirical works presented prospective futures in which the corruption of morals and manners, a decline in military capacity, and a general degeneration through luxury and hedonism have undermined society sufficiently to render it liable, to military conquest. I give some examples here. Dystopian literature, which possesses a strong anti-utopian component, focusing on modern egalitarianism, commences with the radical egalitarian phase of the French Revolution. In Britain, we can point here to two texts. I'm going to skip a little bit here. A work written about Thomas Paine called A Trip to the Island of Equality in 1792, which I describe here, and some texts which attempt to answer William Godwin's very famous Enquiry Concerning Political Justice in 1793. But the first internationally significant wave of early dystopian writing occurs in reaction to the immensely popular Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, published in 1888, in which a centralized state and mandatory universal employment in labor armies in particular were widely satirized as threatening tyranny and economic collapse. Here we see that economic crisis and the substantial concentration of economic power in the hands of great corporations or trusts provides the background to the first key phase of the literary dystopia. But of course, already this starts to sound very familiar, like 21st century dystopias. Shifting from a fictional target, the next most important stage of dystopian writing takes Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution of 1917 as its key target, and includes Evgeny Zamyatin's We of 1924 and George Orwell's much better known 1984. These novels, with dozens of others, suggest that the mythical communist society was not being created in the USSR. Instead, a regime based on fearsome totalitarian despotism, uniformity, the tyranny of the machine, and in Stalin's case, a loathsome personal dictatorship, resulted in an inversion or parody of utopian aspiration. By the late 19th century, we also witnessed the appearance of works which begin to project environmental catastrophe rather than human folly as a cause of the collapse of civilization and the reversion of humanity to barbarism. Richard Jefferies' After London, or Wild England of 1885, which William Morris admired, is an early instance of this trend. The dystopian turn, as it's sometimes called, also involved the specter of machinery generally dominating mankind, regardless of the political system under which it was introduced. This line of thought, first suggested at length in Samuel Butler's Erewhon of 1872, would fuel speculation first about the impact of robots, then moving into the 20th century about the role of cyborgs and various mixtures of artificial and natural beings, which would eventuate in the suggestion that we are entering a potentially post-human age. Again, a very familiar theme for us today. The eugenic manipulation of humanity in order to achieve both more perfect specimens of the ruling class and an orderly, docile slave or working class were widely mooted in the post-Darwinian period, though many associate these themes today with Huxley's Brave New World. But few later 19th and early 20th century works suggested that utopianism as such was the problem. Many indeed ventured to propose their own utopias in place of those seen to be likely to fail or as having already slid into catastrophe. The socialist George Orwell's great success, in particular, lay in the fact that he did not fall prey to the happy ending syndrome and whisk away by wishful thinking what he thought history would not deliver. Possessed of a powerful sense of the necessity of truth-telling, even in fiction, and emphatic about the need to resist the reduction of all narratives to mere propaganda, as in Stalinism and Nazism, Orwell feared that, quote, the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. This, of course, has very powerful echoes today. He asserted that a level-headed, depressing pessimism suited an age in which the triumph of Soviet totalitarianism, or possibly nuclear war, or both, were real possibilities. The point here is that dystopia could modify utopia by introducing realist premises. Here the writer's function is seen as truth-telling, not dream-selling. If you want feel-good hope, Orwell would probably have said, go to church or go to Hollywood. Here, the official communist ideology of hope as an instrument of state propaganda, sometimes described as an adolescent optimism, is as much a target as the actual results of Stalinism. Yet Orwell too preferred hope for his readers, both in the novel and, as importantly, probably more importantly, outside of it. We need to remember that while Stalinists have criticized 1984, even to the present day, Orwell remained a socialist committed to the principles established in Labour's great victory of 1945. Only in the hands of overt critics of utopianism as such, like Friedrich von Hayek or Karl Popper, do we encounter the allegation that the search for utopia as such invariably results in dystopia, still a familiar theme for many today. But even here, there's often lack of conceptual clarity. From our own perspective, then, it's the utopias of the post-Second World War period which begin to portray a threatening future, which is not only familiar to us in 2018, but a great deal more plausible and realistic. The destruction of the natural environment begins to loom large as a theme already in the 1960s. The modern ecological movement usually dates its inception from the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring of 1962. Although Malthus had targeted William Godwin in the Essay on Population of 1798, it was not until the 1960s that the possibility of world overpopulation began to inspire a new generation of dystopian writers. Harry Harrison's Make Room of 1966 projected a world of 7 billion people in 1999. This seemed very frightening at the time, 16 years before we actually attained this population. Here, New York City contains 35 million people. The oil, the topsoil, the animals, the trees are all gone, and much of what remains is poisoned. The United States has monopolized most of the world's resources. The Save Our Babies nuts, mostly Catholics, resist any attempt to restrain births. Overpopulation similarly dominates Anthony Burgess's The Wanting Seed of 1962, where children are rationed to 1 birth per family. You may remember China's attempt to institutionalize this. And the Popol, as they're called, or population police, scrutinize family size. John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar of 1968 also projects a population of 7 billion in the year 2010, missing by only 4 years the actual date at which this occurred. Family size has now shrunk, but there are many restrictions on emigration, and eugenics legislation has eliminated deformed fetuses in some areas. Corporate control exacerbates these problems, and machines, especially computers, tend increasingly to dominate humanity. Ira Levin's This Perfect Day of 1970 similarly involves restricting family size in a population of 8 billion now, and widespread monitoring of the populace, as well as the restraint of behavioral excesses through the enforced medication of the population. Max Ehrlich's The Edict of 1971, these are all quite well-known books in their own time, by the way, portrays the failure of zero population growth, which was a great slogan of the early 70s, and the subsequent decline of food supplies. There are few birds, trees, or grass, and most pets have long since been eaten. Population density drives an intense selfishness and struggle for existence in which trust and friendship are rapidly disappearing completely. When a plan evolves to curtail all births for 30 years to stop children being born, robot babies are handed out to selected possible parents to keep alive the skills necessary for parenthood. Here, curiously, the personal drama around which most of these novels involves a rebel figure giving birth to a real child as an act of rebellion. This involves real freedom, we are told, and the sense of acting like real human beings, which finally also involves, in this case, fleeing to a desolate island. Also in this period, Naomi Mitchison's Solution 3 of 1975 envisions gender restructuring as a means of solving the population issue. Here, after contraception, abortion, and the rising cost of living have failed to stem overpopulation, the world government introduces cloning to introduce a new generation of homosexual and mixed race he and she humans destined to control the world. The first of the later global warming scenarios also appear in this period. J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World of 1963 envisions solar flares rather than human activity as the cause of massive temperature rises. Only 5 million people have survived, living mostly at the poles. But enormous clouds of mosquitoes the size of dragonflies proliferate, along with reptiles, bats, snakes, and spiders. John Brunner's The Sheep Look Up of 1972 portrays environmental destruction as resulting in the poisoning of the seas and the air. Traffic is nearly as thick as the air. Crime is out of control. The wealthy have fled to gated compounds where they are guarded by private armies. The rest inhabit vast slums crawling with rats. Their life expectancy is declining, and starvation is not uncommon. Here, however, like in many other novels, a utopian exit is hinted at in the presence of rebels who live in small communes and reject the dominant ideology. More recently, global warming is seen as reversing in Maggie G's 1998 novel, The Ice People, where a new ice age reduces much of the world's population. The Noah's Ark scenario is present in another more recent novel, Abby Curtis's Water and Glass. The threat of nuclear war is, of course, also a standard trope in this period. In the background in 1984, further developed in William Golding's The Lord of the Flies and many other works. These novels often depict a future growing directly out of existing international antagonisms, out of the logical development of capitalism and or emanating from technological innovations in the present. The recent trend in dystopian fiction is, however, often less specific about the causes of potential future human catastrophe. The popularity of post-apocalyptic works, like Cormac McCarthy's The Road of 2006, where an unspecified disaster involving nuclear war and epidemics has occurred, or Jim Crace's The Pest House of 2007, which also gives us little sense of how civilization has come to collapse, suggest a distancing from the social and political confrontations of the 1960s and 1970s, and an apparent unwillingness to engage in ideological criticism in particular. As we're all well aware, such confrontations frequently interfere with, if not utterly undermine, the entertainment value of such projections. So too does the need to provide some personal, individual escape from devastating scenarios, the chief requisite of the happy ending. We as readers or viewers want one person whom we can identify with to escape from the catastrophe, so that when we get up and leave the novel to one side or leave the cinema, we're happy, we feel good, we've been saved or rescued. But such, of course, is merely an escape mechanism. It may be difficult for us to envision the end of capitalism and its replacement by another social and economic system. It's even harder to portray a conversation about doing so in literature or on the screen. We've become more intolerant of complexity, more impatient, perhaps, with human conversation itself, in the latest phase of the evolution of our engagement with technology. This hampers our capacity to address the deeper problems looming just over our horizons. These problems, however, demand confrontation both speedily and decisively. Turning to our own future possible dystopia, then, we see immediately that these results chiefly from the failure of the liberal utopia of unlimited consumption, production, and population growth. This characteristically 19th century vision, shared substantially by both the capitalists and Marx, has finally run into the sands. The grand utopian dream of communist society here proves just as unworkable as its liberal counterpart. We know now that with 7.6 billion people, we lack the resources to provide a just and humane life for all of the Earth's inhabitants. The promise of utopia as unlimited opulence or cornucopia for unlimited numbers is bankrupt. And yet we are utterly unable to face the implications of this premise. Overpopulation remains the most important problem we face, but it is also the last taboo in international affairs. On any reasonable historical reckoning, assessing our environmental and demographic prospects in particular, then mankind's future is a bleak one. Whether we reach catastrophe and apocalypse, real human annihilation, is another matter. But we've been close enough with around 1,000 accidents involving nuclear weapons over the past 70 years. Observers of international agreements on climate change will gain little sustenance for an optimistic outlook either. We are well on track to exceed temperatures at which mankind can comfortably survive. Despite a series of international meetings, from Kyoto to most recently Paris, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise at an average rate of some 4.5% per year. The much vaunted goal of sustaining emissions at a 2 degrees Celsius limit now seems very unlikely to be achieved. Average rates of warming now having exceeded 1.35% over the past decade. Readers of Mark Linus's 6 Degrees or Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything will be aware that a consensus has emerged respecting the turning point of the 2 degrees Celsius limit. These authors posit, or I should say posited, since it's now gone, that 2017 is, or now was, the last year, the final point at which further warming might be averted. And indeed, in 2017 and now in 2018, we are seeing climate change scenarios portrayed as realistic, in which 3 degrees and even 4 degrees Celsius of warming are indicated as probable. With these projections come descriptions of extensive aridification and desertification, up to 25% of the Earth's surface in a 2 degrees Celsius scenario, 35 to 40% in 2.5 to 3 degrees. Extensive species loss in the seas and on the land, ocean warming, the destruction of the coral reefs, the loss of both polar ice caps and the glaciers, and a variety of other dire consequences. Even at 2 degrees, what Linus terms a mass scramble would occur following a sea rise of as much as 7 meters. Yet there are more immediate and even more threatening developments to confront. Already, we are seeing dramatic drops in bee and other insect populations in areas where pesticides have been permitted over lengthy periods. Yet these are the basis of the food chain upon which our lives depends. So, we will have to contend with scenarios which pass beyond the 2 degree Celsius ceiling. As many here are doubtless aware, however, potential tipping points exist: the melting of the North Pole, the Western Antarctic ice cap, the Siberian tundra in particular, which could intensify the rate of warming and make any reduction or even low-level stabilization in global temperatures nearly impossible. So rather than seeing a slow, steady increase in temperature, a tipping point indicates the possibility of a very sharp and rapid increase at a particular critical point, beyond which, of course, the likelihood of being able to regain a sustainable environment becomes less and less. The scenarios which accompany 3 degree and 4 degree warming patterns also involve the movement of billions of people from low-lying areas near the sea, as well as billions more from equatorial regions in which only robots will be able to work. These massive shifts of population will accompany a continuous rise in global numbers to a world population of perhaps 20 billion people. Now, of course, all of this is contested, so don't take my word for it. I'm taking the more extreme formulations here. Many of our largest cities, located on or near the sea, will rise by about 40% in numbers through the course of this century, just as the waters begin to overwhelm them. In addition, desertification in many regions and a declining amount of agricultural land will hasten famine, war, and disease. Other sources of food supply, especially the sea, will also be depleted. At 4 degrees Celsius, even northern Europe would be subtropical, and it is unlikely that we could sit comfortably here in Madrid, which may well resemble the Sahara by 2050. At 5 degrees Celsius, no ice sheets or rainforests would exist any longer. At 6 degrees Celsius, the end arrives as surely as the passage of time itself, but with no ark to rescue us. These frightening scenarios are now not merely likely, but probably inevitable. Humanity has painted itself into a corner, and by a combination of instinct and stupidity, threatens to wreck our only planet and render it uninhabitable by anything other than machines. Even 3 years ago, when I was completing the research for this book, debates centered on the possibility of a 1.5 to 2 degree Celsius global warming, and international agreements which could sustain this level of overheating. Now, these calculations seem obscenely wishful and delusional. Reality is beginning to intrude upon our consciousness, and the slowly rising sense of species anxiety, which has been nagging at us now for decades, threatens to explode into mass hysteria, even as we endeavor with ever greater futility to pretend that economic growth might once again return and the normality of the late 20th century, our own golden age, in fact, might return. It will not. The new normal we now increasingly recognize is that a third threat increasingly arises after economic and environmental crisis in the form of robotization and the further elimination of millions of jobs, up to perhaps 30% in developed countries by 2050 and perhaps 70% by 2100. We are extraordinarily ill prepared to meet even one of these 3 threats. And mired in political corruption, distracted by the endlessly foolish malevolence of a barely sane American president who epitomizes the corporate takeover of modern politics, our means of information equally hampered by deliberate falsification as well as endemic neoliberal ideological distortion, we founder hopelessly in the face of such adversity. The great political ideals of liberty and equality, which agitated our 19th and 20th century ancestors, the great promises of freedom and opulence, which produced the revolutionary ruptures of modernity, now seem vapid, almost irrelevant, in face of the twin threats of corporate dictatorship and environmental degradation, which may now potentially overwhelm us. The opening prospects of a greater toleration for the oppressed, for minorities, for women, and so on, which opened up in the later 20th century, now witnesses a backlash of epic proportions in which new forms of oppression are hinted at. The immense popularity of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, as both a novel and a TV series now, indicates clearly how far the culture wars evident in the United States in particular, but in fact present virtually everywhere, threaten a real suppression of feminism in the present day. In such circumstances, it is rational to despair, to succumb to pessimism, even to embrace decadence as a means of snatching a few crumbs of pleasure in the face of eventual destruction. I could stop there, of course, but yet we are all aware that intellectuals have a duty to combat nihilism. We're not living at the end of the 19th century in the shadow of Nietzsche. We're living in the 21st century. whether by literary projection or political debate, perhaps more than in any preceding era of human history, those who are educated have a duty to explain where we are going and to promote reform as a means of avoiding a catastrophe greater than that ever faced by our species throughout recorded history. So is there hope against hope or hope after hope? And what does it mean to ask such a question? Can utopia be combined with realism, or are we condemned to remain, with the churches and Hollywood, a vehicle for fantasies of the happy ending, in the afterlife or in this one? By way of conclusion, I want to plead for the marriage of dystopia to utopia, not the destruction of utopia by dystopia, which you might well imagine is what I've been telling you so far. We're all well aware that dystopian literature, and even more film, has the capacity to capture the public imagination far more quickly and to a much greater effect than any form of propagandistic effort by governments or scientists. Yet writers and producers need to accept the wider narrative I've portrayed here before any hope of transforming opinion and habits of behavior can occur. In particular, the restraint of population and of consumption requires head-on conflict with many of the world's religions and a revolution in feminist thinking in particular, which will enable women to achieve sustainable levels of birth control. The ideology of consumption itself, with its fixation upon luxury and the commodification of personal identity, the identification of the self with the things we own, the things we consume, rather than with some other ideal, needs to be reversed in a relatively short time. This seems, of course, completely impossible. An imaginative leap in these areas is not, however, impossible. We need to realize, however, that the function of utopia here is not to imagine the perfect society, and actually never was. For neither More's utopia nor most of its successors was ever intended to be portrayed as perfect. Instead, utopia here functions as a way of seeing through the immense problems facing us and imagining solutions which actually match up with the problems, rather than being snatched rabbit-like from the magician's hat. One purpose of utopia may well be to give a shape to otherwise inchoate or ill-expressed human hopes, particularly given the failure of so-called scientific socialism to deliver a once inevitable communist society. One purpose of dystopia, however, is precisely to depress the wilder and more unrealistic of these hopes, to temper their extremism by recourse to empirical observation. There remains here, of course, the very real problem that people do not like bad news. Sometimes they shoot the messenger, indeed, and will avoid it wherever possible. This propensity thwarts every effort to appreciate our predicament. We just close our ears because it's just more than we can bear. And there remains, too, the even more destructive tendency to believe that our own God-given rights as humans, and particularly as parents, permit us to follow any course of action our religions or our personal whimsy may dictate. To introduce the concept of utopia in the 21st century, then, is perhaps a more uphill battle than in any preceding period in human history. We've seen in the past year, however, several indicators which lend some credence to this possibility. Firstly, the international reception given to Rutger Bregman's Utopia for Realists, published in 2017, indicates that the scheme for a universal basic income, which Bregman describes, is attractive to both right and left as a means of meeting crises emanating both from further industrialization and from deficiencies in existing welfare systems. Secondly, the revelations attendant upon the release of what are usually called the Panama and the Paradise Papers indicate that the scale of tax avoidance through offshore tax havens by the wealthy and corporations far exceeds previous estimates. About 1,500 billionaires now control some $6 trillion of the world's wealth, with the richest 1% of the planet owning about 50% of total assets. Tax evasion is estimated to cost governments some 500 billion pounds annually, so perhaps 650 billion euros. And of course, I don't need to talk about tax evasion in Spain, or indeed the Panama or Paradise Papers in Spain. When wedded to global corporate tax avoidance and evasion, these revelations indicate that all the measures described under the rubric of austerity, the cutting of pensions, reducing benefits to the poor, and so on, are completely unnecessary. Calls for a glass revolution of international financial transparency, where, as in the case of Norway, a leader in this area, individual income statistics are published publicly. So every Norwegian knows the income of every other Norwegian. Imagine this in Spain today. And the rate of taxation is harmonized internationally to reduce evasion to a minimum, indicate a step in the direction of reducing income inequality to a much more acceptable level. Thirdly, we are actually making some headway environmentally in shifting towards renewable energy and eliminating harmful forms of pollution. The current US administration of Mr. Trump has curiously had the dialectical effect of awakening a sense of revulsion at corporate greed in much of the rest of the world, and inducing a profound disgust at the destruction of the environment. We recognize that a combination of red and green ideals, alike conservative and revolutionary, can still be applied to the 21st century in order to give us a chance at survival. Fourthly, we now recognize that technological developments will produce not only the possibility of much greater free time for humanity, one goal at which Karl Marx ultimately aspired. Innovations in medicine, genetics, robotics, and many other fields will also allow the prolongation of life, well beyond the current notional maximum. That is, of course, so long as the species itself doesn't disappear. Yet even here, of course, we still recognize the warnings of the Frankenstein scenario, whose origins, of course, we also celebrate this year. Dystopia, then, provides us with the human portrayal of dire futures, which we must avoid if we are indeed to survive. My chief point here today is that none of these remedial utopian measures can be introduced until the full force of the problems we face is discerned, dissected, and then widely acknowledged. Utopia, in other words, relies and depends on dystopia to retain its relevance to our future. Without this contingency, it is a sterile act of fantastic wish fulfillment, which may well obscure rather than illuminate our plight. Let us then think of the future as a dystopia, rather than attempting to distract ourselves from the realities of our condition by pretending that dreaming is any substitute for realistic action. Let us break the bad news as soon as possible. We can yet awaken from the slumber of narcotic modernity and narcissistic delusion. The time is upon us to look up from our phone screens and set aside our obsession with amusement. Time waits for no one. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much for your brilliant talk, Professor Claeys. Now we still have time for some questions.
First of all, thank you very much for coming and for giving us this very inspiring lecture. Just a brief anecdote. When I wrote to Professor Martinez, that lectured on Monday, and I showed him the program, he congratulated us for having you in our program, and he said, okay, well done, because Professor Claeys is the most important scholar probably in the world about this topic, so we felt very very proud of having you with us. Okay, so
Thank you.
the first one. And the second, I miss in this point of view that all the calls are being made, I assume, for asking governments to take action, but can dystopia imply something about personal, family, the small communities to act, or is that wishful thinking to think about small communities? Because for a lot of people, getting to the international agreements, governments can be very, very far away, and okay, what can be done in my family, in my school?
An excellent question and really pertinent. The answer, of course, is to act everywhere at the same time at every possible level. In many respects, as you're well aware, it's much easier for us personally to act because with an act of will, we can make a decision that we want to change our own lives. We can do this at the smallest possible level. I'm going to give you a good instance. There's a very well-known program which was shown a little while ago in Britain called Blue Planet 2. I don't know if it was shown in Spain as well, by David Attenborough, the famous naturalist. It's about the pollution of the oceans by plastic, which is much worse than anybody except the specialists in this field, very few of them, could envision beforehand. One of the effects of this program, this is only now a couple of months ago, was to lead very large numbers of people simply to say overnight, right, no more plastic cups, no more plastic straws. You go to get a coffee. Now in Spain is a civilized country, of course. Usually when you go and have a coffee, you get it in a ceramic cup, and you stand at the bar or in the cafeteria and you have your coffee and they wash the cup. No plastic is needed for the entire procedure. But throughout the world, of course, billions of cups are used every day, the vast majority of which are not recycled because of the way these cups are made. So overnight, hundreds of thousands of people, including me, simply said, from now onwards, we will not use any more plastic cups and plastic straws at all. Now, this is, of course, a very small beginning, but one can move from that. What this proves is that public opinion, first of all, is very susceptible to suggestion. If people become aware, the way this is done is much more powerful, of course, in film. If you see a dolphin dying because it's being strangled by a plastic bag, or if you see a turtle which has a fishing net wrapped around its beak so that it cannot eat any longer. If you see mountains of plastic piling up on the beaches, even in Bali, which is kind of our idea of paradise, you realize all of a sudden, immediately, the problem is much worse than we imagine. And all you need to do is to project, if we do the same thing we've been doing now the last 100 years, for the next 100, it's finished. The world is finished. That is what Attenborough tells us. So immediately at the personal level, but this then, of course, acts as a trigger for understanding, well, of course, if we're going to do this, then let's move further forwards. How can we in our own lives ensure that we recycle all the waste we use, that we don't, about 40% of the food that's grown is not eaten but thrown away. How can we ensure that this drops to nothing by using it for charities, by ensuring that the sell-by date system in the supermarkets is adjusted properly, and so on? Can we shift gradually away from eating meat, which is, of course, highly toxic as far as the environment is concerned? Once the idea is planted that a kind of greening of the self, of the personality is possible, we can move entire populations, I think, relatively quickly in the right direction. Because once one person makes the commitment, then they say to their friends, don't drink coffee out of the plastic cup anymore. Try to recycle your waste, and so on. It's an important moment, but I think a very indicative one. The point, of course, about doing this in your family is that this is the most immediate unit that most of us are a part of. So if you have small children, you're also raising them to envision a world which, sadly, is they will inherit I won't, but my children will, and even more their children. The catastrophe, if it comes, will come in the last decades of this century, 2060, 2070 onwards. So the generation of my grandchildren, effectively. But really already of your children, if you're in your 30s or early 40s. So education of children in the families, but then also, of course, I mean, you started your question with getting the state to act. What this kind of change of behavior indicates is that the state is actually, in many respects, much slower a lot of the time than individuals are. The state is behind public opinion. Now, of course, North America under Trump is a very particular, odd, peculiar example, because here we see a retrograde movement, anti-environmental, if you look at how the Environmental Protection Agency has been taken over by an oil magnate and so on. This is entirely against the grain of the whole modern movement. The modern movement is in the opposite direction, without doubt. But governments are receptive to only one thing, and that is the electorate voting them out of power. If we say to our governments, well, why don't you actually pass a law, as some countries have done, and just ban plastic bags in supermarkets, or ban plastic cups in cafeterias. If we say that we will vote you out of office if you don't do this, we don't rely upon their rationality, because governments are not terribly enlightened bodies as such. They're more interested in power than they are in the long-term future of humanity, of course. But they do listen to electorates who vote them out of power. So again, what this involves is gradually building up a political movement. I think it's not likely to happen in a dramatic way until people become much more frightened than they are now. In order to become frightened, traditionally, we require some kind of catastrophe. What this catastrophe will entail is a little hard to tell at the moment, but you could hint at it. The melting of the poles now, I mean, even since I wrote this, the statistic, as you're aware, today, the temperature at the North Pole is higher than it is in London. And the average temperature for the last 2 weeks at the North Pole is 20 degrees Celsius above the norm. So even, I could have changed the statistics even for what I said about this. If the poles both melt and all the glaciers melt, we will see a very sharp, sudden rise in temperature. This, I don't think, is going to produce an immediate catastrophe, so much as the likelihood is of, for example, the tundra in Russia melting and releasing methane gas in very large quantities is likely, and literally an explosive mixture. The ground starting to blow up, because methane is a highly combustible gas. There are billions of tons of it buried under the frozen tundra. All of it will be released, and it's highly toxic as well as highly combustible. So my suspicion is it's not the accumulation of temperature rise, it's not the slow rise of the oceans that's going to alert the average person. It will be some kind of catastrophe. Unfortunately, we don't wake up quickly. And most of us, and I think the real problem here is we don't want to envision this scenario occurring. No one wants to think that the end of the world is a realistic possibility. But now, for the first time, it is. Only in the last 20 years it's become possible. Now, with every passing hour, it becomes more possible. So we have to wake up, but we can do this individually as well. And of course, you have to talk about it all the time.
I think we don't find what you say in this, for example, the ideology of conception itself, with its fixation upon luxury and the commodification of personal identity, needs to be reversed in a relatively short time. It's a lot of consequences in our ordinary life, I think so.
Yeah, a huge number of consequences. This is not going to happen quickly either, very clearly. It starts, I think, with the understanding, which is a very utopian kind of theme, that the quality of human life isn't determined by the number of commodities we consume. So if you go back to a kind of classic luxury-oriented model, which is very much a model of interpersonal psychological competition. So you have to buy a new car every 2 years, let's say, because your neighbor buys a new car every 2 years. And when your neighbor buys a new car, he pulls it up. I'm using a kind of American scenario here because it's the most common one in Hollywood. Your neighbor buys a new car and he pulls it up in the garage next to your house. And there it sits and he washes it every Saturday. And he says, look at my new car. Look what a great person I am because of this shiny new vehicle which I bought. And I feel meek and humble and ashamed. And I go back and I look at my bank book and I say, do I have enough money? I have to buy a new car now because I'm feeling really weak and inadequate. And so I say to myself, I'm going to work harder and I'm going to borrow some more money. And I'm not only going to buy a new car, my neighbor's bought a Porsche, let's say. So he's really trying to up the game. I'm going to buy a Lamborghini. So I drive my Lamborghini up, and there I am Saturday morning, and I'm polishing it. And he looks at his Porsche, and it might as well be a Seat 500, because it's worthless to him now, because the value of the Porsche lay in the investment of his personality in the commodity. There, in a nutshell, is the whole problem of the commodification of identity. So I think once we recognize this, of course, we haven't won the battle yet. Because what follows from that is, first of all, the renunciation of the cycle of consumption. Secondly, then, we have to instruct those who actually make the commodities that they shouldn't make them so they break every year. Everything, of course, is made with so-called built-in obsolescence, planned obsolescence. This dates already from before the Second World War. People make things so that they break, so that we have to buy new ones. As everybody knows, light bulbs can be made which will last for many years. But most of the ones you buy, or at least bought until very recently, would last a few months or a year perhaps at the longest, because they're made for that purpose. The problem, of course, is the economics of this kind of proposition. If everybody consumes much less, demand for commodities falls dramatically. If commodities are made to last much longer, the number which need to be produced is accordingly much smaller, unless you have a much larger number of people desiring the same commodities, which, if you follow a universal human rights model, the desire for all of the population of the world to have the same standard of living that the developed middle classes have, then everybody's still going to be demanding all of these commodities. But then you run up against the scarcity of the materials which go into the making of those commodities. The economics are extremely difficult to work out. The starting point, however, I think has to be, it kind of goes back to the first question, it goes back to a psychological realization that if you simply plot a world of increasing population, everybody increasing their consumption, increasing production to meet increasing consumption, at some point we run out. And when we run out, then we have absolute scarcity and we have complete catastrophe. And this point is not very far off. It is within, well, maybe not our lifetimes, I don't know how old you are, but probably not in my lifetime anyway, but certainly in the lifetimes of the students we teach and a lot of the people in this room. So in that sense, the decision, while it's a difficult one to make, particularly because all of us have been raised with the idea that the meaning and value of ourself is contingent upon consumption. It's contingent upon commodities. Think about the latest incarnation of this is, of course, the smartphone. Think about the need to have the latest phone which comes out with the best camera and the largest number of apps and all the rest of it. And the fact that when you bring out whatever it is, an iPhone X, or you put it on the table and all your friends look at it and say, well, this is so much better than my phone, so I want to get rid of mine and buy this one. But the same thing holds almost for everything else. We have to be able to make do with less. There's no doubt about that. The moral of the story here, however, is the sooner we realize that we need to restrain personal consumption and restrain the commodification of identity and restrain the process of production as a whole, the less we will, in the long run, force absolute scarcity upon our descendants. So if we're willing to put, it's kind of like a car which is racing towards the cliff. If we start to put the brakes on slowly now, we can come to a more or less gentle stop before we reach the edge of the cliff, which we are certainly perilously hurtling towards. If we wait very late, we're going to have to slam the brakes on. The car will come to a screeching halt. There will be absolute scarcity and certainly relative scarcity of a kind which will be extremely frightening. The first forecasts of this are for food and water. Water, if in Spain, of course, water is already scarce, but it's going to be much scarcer in 20 to 30 years than it is now. This is going to affect the whole of Southern Europe, of course, very large parts of the rest of the world in a similar climate band. After this will come the shortage of food. The shortfall of about, as I said, the latest figures, about 30% less agricultural land by 2050, considerably more, perhaps above 40%, but the truth is no one really knows, by 2060, 2070. So, of course, science and technology will provide some of the fixes to this problem. We'll be able to grow food in a much more concentrated way. We're already learning some of the ways of doing this. The problem is, if population continues to march ever onwards, and if the patterns of consumption and waste remain the same, then the problem remains the same. We're able to produce more and more, but we have ever larger numbers consuming what we produce. And those numbers will always outstrip our capacity to provide a civilized standard of living for the majority. So this is why the most common scenario for dystopia after about 2050 or so, that's only 30 years, remember, it's within the lifetime of most of the people in this room, is that you have a very wealthy 1%. They're going to be living maybe in cities like Madrid. They will not restrain their consumption. But the other 99% of the population, barring maybe a kind of small middle class, the vast majority will be living in huge slums where food will be scarce, water will be scarce, disease, rats, and so on will be rife. That's the most common scenario if we remain on the course we're now on. So I think restraint, again, to answer both these questions in the same way, patterns of restraint have to begin to be implemented.
Fernando?
Yes, thank you for this inspiring speech. I've got a question about the last 10 years. Some bestsellers, novels for teenagers were actually dystopias, like The Maze Runner, Hunger Games, and the last one is Divergent, something like this. What do you think about it? I mean, they were bestsellers and actually wonderful films later, I suppose too, I haven't read. What do you think about these teenagers, this new generation that really enjoy these dystopian books and films, and if they really if they have action? Because there is an aspect of these ones that have a happy ending. Are they real dystopias, or what do you think about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, of course, far more people are reading young adult dystopias certainly than are reading my book, or I'd be in a very different position today, than are reading all of the literary fiction dystopias written for adults. Far more. And far more still are looking at the films, but a large number, of course, are reading the books which are made after the films, or reading the books after they've seen the film. So their first entry point is into cinema. So I think there are three things to be said about this. First thing is, this is a very good and healthy phenomena insofar as it introduces the theme of potential catastrophe to younger audiences. It sort of warms them up for what we in university will be teaching them about the reality of the potential future they will face. So that's the good part. So then follows several bits which are not so good. And as you've already indicated, the happy ending scenario, which Hollywood seemingly has to provide us, along with then at the same time the individual superhero figure who manages somehow, despite all the odds, to win out, to conquer, to defeat the great villain. Often also seen now in Hollywood films about superheroes imbued with magical powers and so on. This, of course, rather diverts younger readers from confronting the reality of what they face. So it's a very good thing that the prospect of catastrophe is placed before younger people. It's a very bad thing that it's Hollywood doing this, because in typical Hollywood fashion, they're wrecking what is potentially a very valuable way of informing people. But that's not, of course, the function of these films. They're not there to purvey bad information. They're there to entertain. We have to recognize that. And I'm wrong in a way to be critical of them from this point of view, because it's our job to inform. It's our job to criticize. That's what universities are about, although sadly our administrators sometimes forget this. Universities are the heart of the criticism of society and of governments. And we are the ones who should be leading in this regard. However, the third aspect of this then is also quite positive. It was the case about 10 years or so ago, maybe even going back to the late 1990s, when the Hunger Games and some of the other earlier young adult dystopias were first beginning to be produced as films by Hollywood, that academic critics in universities said, this stuff is not interesting, we don't deal with children's literature, maybe you can specialize with this, but it's all dumbed down. And so it's not interesting for us, and it's not going to make the kids better informed than they are now about the really serious problems anyway. What we've seen just in the last couple of years, but I can say this with respect to the United States, with respect just to the last couple of weeks now, that young people have turned out to be, this rising generation, much more politically conscious and much more energetic politically than anyone suspected. If you look at the latest school massacre now in Florida, I don't know if any of you have been following this in Spain. This has become a cause célèbre of great importance across the world, not so much because we face the same problems that the Americans do, because thankfully we have laws which restrict access to military-style firearms, but because what this proves is that when young people get angry, they now have, thanks to their new smartphones, collective means of organizing themselves quite radically and quite dramatically, and they have the political will to go against their legislators, both near and far, in this case in Florida and in Washington, D.C. This is a quite startling indication that the coming generation, those who are now in high school, those who are now in university, may for the first time be faced with all these extremely bleak scenarios that were obviously available to those in school and university for the last 20 years or so. But has anything momentous and dramatic happened by these two last generations? No. This generation will probably be the first generation now that breaks from that pattern. That's my sense of what's going on now. The moral of the story will be made obvious and apparent. The fact that it's necessary to make dramatic personal statements, including demonstrations, marching, and so on. The prospect of, we've seen this week, we have a strike in the UK university system this week. And I was on strike on Monday and Tuesday, and my colleagues are on strike today because they're trying to destroy our pensions, basically. Our administrators are trying to pay themselves very high salaries, and they want to take our pensions away in part to pay themselves high salaries, and we said, no, this is not fair. But one of the things we've seen is that our students are very militant in favor of our strike, and they're actually occupying university offices in a way in which some of you are old enough to remember 1968, in a way which we have not seen for 50 years. And nobody anticipated this, and their teachers didn't tell them, you should go and occupy the principal's office. They did it on their own. They thought it up on their own. So there's, I think, a latent sense of both despair and, on the other hand, militancy, which is there amongst younger people, which we thought when these films and novels were first being produced, this wouldn't tap into that, and it wouldn't agitate younger people. And in fact, the generation of our students today, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, are much more irritated, much more radical than we thought they were indeed. What they need is the spark, which is why Iskra is Lenin's favorite, of course, periodical, the spark which lights the fire. That spark could come from any number of different sources. When it comes, I think the best parallel for us today is 1968. This scenario is not exactly the same because 1968 was a revolt born in many respects out of privilege, whereas our students today, and a lot of us, are in a much more precarious position than students and academics were, who were much more privileged in 68 than they are now. But yet, a different mixture can serve as tinder to feed exactly a fire like that. All we need is the ignition, but the potential is there again.
And we are in the 40th anniversary of 68.
We are, as it happens, yes, coming up in the first week of May. So we should watch for this.
Well, we've got 3 questions then. If you don't mind, you ask, you answer, and then he will give a general answer, because we are sure.
So if you allow me to ask first. I found very interesting your reflection on about John Distópicas, but I would like to introduce 2 relevant questions in this reflection. First is that I think younger users of new technologies, of smartphones, tablets, social nets, are activists. I mean, they want to do something now, but I'm not sure if they are going to be a permanent way of create a change. And the other reflection is about entertainment. I'm not very sure if when they are watching Hunger Games, they are thinking about this as a tragedy, or they are thinking about this as something entertainment. So I would like to know what you think about these 2 elements, because I think they can change a bit our perception.
Then, the second question, please.
My question is kind of related as well. If you were to make a TV series or a film right now, like a dystopian TV series, what age group would you target it to? Like, would you go for a young audience, or because this is very already very popular, you would go for a different age group? And then if you were to target it to a young audience, would you change any elements in particular from the ones already existing?
Phew.
Difficult question.
Yeah,
Ana
indeed.
Clara.
Related to the necessary changes that you were talking before, in which level these changes are related not only to small changes, but also to the need to imagine worlds beyond capitalism, because these changes contradict the very logic of the capitalist system and its model of production.
Okay, indeed. So these are all incredibly complicated questions. So the first issue, the 2 questions. First of all, what happens to activity when it's focused on something very narrow and local, but then the energies run out? I think we do need an agenda, we do need a kind of program, and we need leaders, of course. And we don't have many of any of these at the moment. We need a long-term strategy. And my sense is at the moment, the only thing that the existing system, kind of goes back to the last question, is receptive to is a boycott. So that if you go into a coffee shop, let's say Starbucks or one of the big chains, you go into a coffee shop and you say, oh, I'd like a coffee, and then you look and you see, oh, you have only plastic cups, right? Then Starbucks, I think, does have both kinds. But in London, a lot of places will only give you plastic cups. So you say then, oh, I'm sorry then, I cancel my order. I'm not going to have it if it's only in a plastic cup. So you're placing pressure on them. The next stage up is you stand outside within your legal rights, of course, with a banner or with posters and so on, and you say, don't buy coffee here, buy coffee over here where you don't need to have a plastic cup. Now the same thing holds for almost everything else. One of the things that's most evident about this great controversy in the US with the National Rifle Association, the NRA, supporting semi-automatic weapons, the AR-15, which is an assault rifle so-called, being legally sold to 18-year-olds. One of the things that's been very clear about this is the public pressure upon those who use NRA advertising, airlines, car rental firms, and so on, was very great in a very pronounced manner very quickly, and all of a sudden these firms melted away completely within hours, virtually, over the course of a couple of days. They renounced their association with the NRA as a consequence, because consumers wrote in and said to them, I will not hire a car from you if you are associated with the NRA. It's that simple. So the boycott in the first, which of course has a very long, going back to the 19th century, back to Gandhi and so on, has a very long pedigree as a form of protest. But the brief answer is, of course, we need a wider strategy of which the boycott is only a part. My sense is that's the next stage beyond the individual consumer putting pressure upon retail outlets. So second question is about entertainment. I'm not an expert in viewer perception and so on. I dare say you're right, however, about this. Most people are not getting really why the society of the future portrayed in the Hunger Games is a vicious despotism, much less than asking the question to themselves, well, what if this is a society that looks like my society? Are there any signs in my society, like Mr. Trump, which indicate that we're actually moving in this direction? And if such signs do exist, how can we prevent this happening? Now, of course, one of the things the Trump presidency has indicated is these signs are plentiful everywhere. This looks very much like the face of corporate dictatorship as it's expressed in the 1950s and the 1960s. There's a whole host of very good novels published in that period. This is the first period. It's after Eisenhower condemns the military-industrial complex, you may remember. In the mid-50s, there's a whole host of novels which come out. I don't think many viewers put these pieces to the puzzle together. This kind of takes me to the answer to the third question, however. So the second question is really interesting, and nobody has ever asked me this, although should you have the chance to, well, maybe not buy the book, wait till the paperback edition comes out anyway, because it's a lot cheaper. The last 4 pages of this book, I kind of got wild, as you do when you spend 5 long, depressing, intense years reading about terrible things happening to humanity. Because I go here through Stalinism and Auschwitz and all the rest of the horrors of the 20th century before I even get to literary fiction. The last couple of pages of the book, I let myself go, and I kind of spin out a narrative of what my own vision of a 20th century dystopia would look like, with literary hints as to how it would be projected. And it's almost filmable as such. Now, let me keep the copyright for it, just in case anybody here gets the idea. What I would do, because I think you have an absolutely legitimate and really important question here about the levels you pitch it to. If you made it entirely a young adult work, I don't think it would work at all. Because I wouldn't want a single 18-year-old heroine to rescue humanity from the evils of global warming. Because why? It's not possible. It's simply not possible. It's not a despotism that's causing global warming. If you were to assassinate Donald Trump tomorrow, heaven help us, that's not the answer. We don't want to make a martyr of the man. You wouldn't do anything to solving the problem of global warming. These problems are much more complex, and as one of the questions indicated, they are problems about our own engagement with the world around us. They're problems about how we identify as consumers. They're problems about the standard of living that we all desire, in our own view, quite legitimately. But, however, you can't make it an abstract exercise of a bunch of professors sitting at a table discussing the woeful dystopia of the 21st century, because nobody's going to buy it as a film, obviously. So you have to somehow square this circle, and it's extremely difficult to do this. You need vivid, real-life characters who have to be attractive. I mean, film is about characters that most people can identify with. They have to have strong virtues. That's why they're heroes, of course. But yet at the same time, they have to be able to engage with the complexity of the science and the sociology and the psychology all at once. So they have to be able to understand global warming. They have to be able to understand human psychology en masse. That's the crowd and the group and so on, which is the subject of the first third of my book. They have to be able to understand the psychology of consumption, which is the root of the whole problem, I think. And therefore, they need to be somehow a combination of things which are very rarely found in one person. So what you want, ideally then, very cinematic, attractive, 26-year-old PhD, 3 PhDs, however, right? Climate science, psychology, sociology, maybe philosophy, political theory as well. Positioned in exactly the right time and place that this dramatic moment, which, as I suggested earlier, could be a tipping point, occurs, where then, to go back to a couple of earlier questions, you all of a sudden have the younger generation waking up, just like that, and saying, we realize now what you're talking about. We realize this is not a fantasy. This is not just bad news, which we can stick our heads in the sand. We now come together as a generation. This is our fate, and our children's fate, and our grandchildren's fate. We're going to do something about it. And the first thing that will happen, of course, and here the parallels to 68 are really very good, is they're going to turn around with hatred against the generation of their parents and their grandparents. And they're going to say, you did this to us. All this time when you were enjoying yourselves with the Porsches and the holidays and the fine houses and all the rest of it, you were destroying the planet and paying no attention to the consequences, and this is what you've given us. The generation conflict is going to be very extreme, I think, at exactly that point. We tend to forget today that's what triggers a great deal of what happens in 68 as well, is the clash of, all of a sudden, the clash of the values of the generation of the 40s and 50s with those of the values of the generation of the 60s. So that's going to happen as well. So here you have let's make her a woman. Let's give her 3 PhDs. She becomes a global leader of a rising youth movement exactly at this critical moment when one of these tipping points occurs. There's your film. Build in robots who play a major role. Depends on the year. If we're doing this in 2025, you don't need robots to play a major role. You're doing it in 2055, robots might be your assistants. You're doing it in 2095, the robots might be leading the revolution. And it might be against humanity. That's, I don't spoil the story, but that's the last part of the scenario that's portrayed here. So Then finally, the last question. How do we come round? Almost everything I've hinted at so far indicates that capitalism is bust. Right now, people have been saying this from long before Karl Marx said it, of course, and Marx, who's very much on my mind because the last book I wrote after this is on him. It's out in about a month or so, so I have Marx on the brain at the moment. Marx's answer to this remains in many respects every bit as valid as the discussion, particularly in the later economic writings, the contribution, the critique of political economy, capital, the chapter on machines in the Grundrisse is the most important. Now here the shift from, I don't want to go into a Marx lecture mode, but the shift from the focus on the theory of alienation and the young Marx to the idea that it is free time for the working classes, which really represents what socialism will deliver to them after capitalism. This is absolutely applicable to the middle and latter parts of the 21st century. We will have vast parts of the population, as much as 70%, with no necessary employment. Now they may do things, they may make things, they may play a lot, they may be rowing a great deal as the waters rise and so on, but they won't have to work, according to one scenario here. So this is, as you rightly indicate, a post-capitalist scenario. Now, one of the real problems, along with a great many of the others which we've looked at here, which are not easily soluble, is the 1991 problem. Marx goes bankrupt when the Soviet Union goes down the drain. For 20 years, approximately, hardly anybody reads Marx. I know I was lecturing on him, 2 lectures a year. For all this period, I noticed the enthusiasm of 68 goes down in 88, sinks to the bottom in 98, and then rises sharply again in 2008. The last financial crisis really generates a huge amount of interest again in Marx. So I'm speaking in both Russia and China as it happens next month, in May rather, on this. And you may well have noted from Mr. Xi's pronouncement this week, the head of state in China, that he has nominated himself for the post of leader for life. You may have noticed that one brand of Marxism is actually alive and well and thriving. And in fact, China, of course, although its military expenditure is still a fraction of that of the United States, a fifth or so, China is set to overtake the US in economic power very shortly, within a year or so. It has, because of the peculiar advantages of a centralized authoritarian state, it has the capacity to act quite dramatically quickly in a way which democratic societies don't. So this brand of Marxism is going to be one of the ones that competes with other visions of a post-capitalist future in other countries outside of China in the 21st century. But the Chinese are buying influence everywhere, of course. So are the Russians, but of course they're not selling Marxism anymore. They're selling Putinism, which increasingly looks like Stalinism. And Stalin is being rehabilitated, sadly, in Russia today. I mean, literally, new statues going up, new television programs celebrating Stalin as a great leader. I think this is all folly, but and I will tell them so, but so be it. It does indicate to us that the rethinking of the model can't be completely out of new elements. We have to use some of the ideological critique which has been there. I mean, from my experience, it's well before Marx. The early socialists, Owen, Fourier, Saint-Simon, and so on, are still really usable today. To go back to the question of small-scale community living in particular, they're much more helpful than Marx is. But we need all of this anti-Marxist set of alternatives to be put back on the table and to ask, well, if the time finally has come, if Marx was wrong in the 19th century and Marxism got it wrong in the 20th century, maybe actually in the 21st century, much of the story will turn out to be what Marx predicted. Not quite maybe in the way he predicts, maybe there will be no cataclysmic collapse of capitalism, but remember later on in life Marx said, and many of his followers said, capitalism might change peacefully. It might change through the ballot box. In Holland or Britain or Germany was the greatest possibility by the 1890s. But again, this goes back to the question of creating a new kind of grassroots movement where people are committed to an alternative which turns away from existing patterns of production, consumption, commodification of identity, proposes a new alternate variant program on this, shows how we get from where we are today to this model, and not only implements the program, but throws up these 24-year-old, 3 PhD leaders to take us forwards into the future. It's all possible. I mean, I have to say it's possible because, of course, amongst all of the dire dystopian possibilities, there also remain these possibilities of turning around the scenarios. All of the worst case scenarios rely upon the assumption that we will be as blind and stupid and our leaders as short-sighted, malevolent as they have proven to be in the past. But we're capable of change. We're capable of malleability, of shifting our behavior. But whether we will or not, well, I don't know. Good question.
Well, thank you very much for your talk and for answering our questions. Well, our Congress has come to the end. And I would like to thank the students and all the attendants to this Congress on Dystopias. I would also like to thank the lecturers, those who have given the talks, those who have presented the papers. Especially I would like to thank Anne-May Duan and say again that we are deeply honored by the presence of Professor Claeys. And I would also like to thank all the teachers at CEU San Pablo University who have brought their students, who have helped us prepare this Congress. To the publishing service here at the university, Pablo Velasco, who will soon publish and arrange all the material to be published, and you will see your papers there. And of course, I would like to thank Pablo Gutierrez, who has led all the organization of this Congress. I expect and I hope that you have learned a lot, and this has answered many of the initial questions that we posed. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Your talk has raised